Okay. Can everyone see that PowerPoint? Yes, okay. I'm gonna leave the chat up too so I can see as we're going through. Okay. All right, so like I said, we're going to talk about kind of the correlation between, the effects of mental health and hazing. I am a former sorority member, so I've been through a lot of maybe what you all have experienced. So I have some knowledge, and I really enjoy working with all different student organizations. College can be a great time to really find yourself and change yourself, and then learn more about yourself too. And I, have seen that be developed throughout the fraternity and sorority life experience as well. So I'm glad so many people could join today, because one, how to change the culture starts with community involvement. So this obviously just demonstrates that this is important and impactful for you all. So again, I wanted to just say thank you, and that it's really impressive to me how invested everyone seems to be. So I do want to start with the mental health aspect before we get into what hazing is. So when you think about mental health, how would you describe it? What does that definition mean to you?
Is it open for discussion here?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
It's just I think mental health is your mental well-being.
Okay.
Just what you can do to keep that good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. And then I apologize, Taia, I hope I said that right, says that to mental health is how you are doing mentally, whether you're good, bad, sad, or frustrated. And then Savannah just stated that mental health is your thoughts, feelings, and emotions, which are all different and great descriptions of what mental health is. So it doesn't include our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. So it's not just one thing. We know the brain is a complicated place, and it affects, it's all about what stems everywhere in our body stems from our brain first. So it affects how we think, feel, and act. Mental health also helps determine how we handle stress, relate to others, and make choices. Now, the difference between like just mental health and mental health disorder is when a condition affects someone's feeling, behavior, or mood in thinking on a majority day-to-day basis, and it can affect the ability to relate to others in a lot of ways. But some statistics that is important to know is that more than 80% of college students have reported in the last year even that they felt overwhelmed by all they have to do. So about 1 in 5 people on average are affected by mental health disorders. So when you think about it, it's a lot. It's almost as common as any other physical ailment or medical condition. It's just not talked about as much because you can't really see what's going on in the brain. It's our behavior and our thoughts and our feelings. It's a lot different than noticing when someone's coughing or sneezing or has a physical injury that you can tell. But the number one reason that people don't seek help is stigma. And so my hope is that the more we talk about mental health, the more that people will feel that they are allowed to talk about this and feel safe to talk about this, because a lot of times what's in our mind, our thoughts, our feelings, until they're said out loud, it feels very uncharted territory, more than just how you display something like when you're not feeling well, like a stomach ache or a sore throat, things like that. So defining hazing, how would you define hazing? And if someone raises their hand, I'm trying to kind of scroll through, but feel free just to unmute yourself or put in the chat. You can do it to everyone or just to me. I don't have to say your name out loud if you don't want to say.
I would say a force or an act of a force of making someone do something they don't want to do.
Okay. All right, so Hannah said the intentional mental or physical endangerment for the purpose of initiations. And then Savannah said any activity that makes someone feel uncomfortable, whether that be forced or unforced. Any other responses about what hazing means to them? Yeah, those are all pretty accurate response. Damage to emotional, physical state. Yeah. So it's any activity expected of someone joining or participating in a group that humiliates, degrades, abuses, or endangers them, regardless of a person's willingness to participate. So I know that's pretty broad and it can be somewhat up to interpretation, but when we think about specifics, it goes beyond harmless and voluntary initiations that a person may agree to when they join a club. So specific things that would be, you know, repeating some kind of like back and forth and going along with a group like that is a lot different than repeating something so you don't get punished for, you know, saying it out loud. Something like that is a lot different. And we see things like traditions of, you know, how initiation goes versus like different rules that, you know, keeping your secrets as a fraternity and sorority and like not sharing some of those things with other people outside of the membership. That's different than something that you feel like there's going to be fear of harm or abuse if that comes to it. So when we think about hazing beliefs, what organization and potential new member beliefs come from hazing? So what do we believe about hazing that either makes it feel like it's acceptable or new members feel like it's okay for hazing to come into or to experience? Okay. So Anna said freshmen trying to get approval. Alden said new members might think that they otherwise won't get in. A member could think I had to do this to be initiated, so the new members have to too, said Savannah. Samantha said if it's a tradition, then it's something that everyone who has come before has done. Yep. And then Hunter said that everyone says that everyone has gone through it at some point. Yeah. So there's this idea of group think that happens, or a sense of belonging. Yeah. So tradition is the number one thing. We've done this for years, so you just keep doing it. The attitude of how the organization presents things. Kyla said mandatory for membership. So the process, everyone has to go through it. You have to do these steps to become part of our group. Context, so depending on where you live or what is going on in the world at the time, maybe that is part of it, or a sense of family history or having legacy status for context. Respect or approval. So yeah, definitely from a new member standpoint, I want to fit in, so I need to do this to either impress or be made good enough to be a part of the organization. Again, that belonging versus rejection. If I don't do this, then I'm going to be, you know, cut from membership, or maybe I won't be able to join. Proving yourself, so toughness, like I can handle this, I'm worthy. Damaging a psychological context like that. And then perceived to be typical or normal, which goes back to tradition. Again, we've always done this and it should continue to be like this. So when we think about what those beliefs are, now we want to move into how we're going to change those beliefs as well. And I want to make a distinction of what hazing is versus bullying. So what do we think the difference is between hazing and bullying? Or do we think that there's a difference between hazing and bullying? Okay. So one person's Jaden said usually targets a specific
that,
person.
You know,
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was going to say that hazing, like you said, is something that, you know, has been going on for years, and it's kind of a tradition. Everyone else had to do it, so you have to do it. But I think bullying could be something like that's kind of degrading to someone, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely very much aspects of it. Easier to catch bullying, whereas hazing may go under the radar. Absolutely. Could be part of it, depending on what the bullying looks like. Okay, so bullying, so we also said, Savannah said, hazing can happen for someone to join an organization. Bullying is to exclude someone. That's also part of it as well. So it's a verbal and or physical aggression that is meant to harm the victim psychologically or physically. So it could be a form of trying to make them, you know, submit to belong. It's, you know, an aspect of power and control. But yes, it is usually more to be a part of a small group or one person to victimize individuals who they believe are vulnerable. So the vulnerable part is the key piece, because it's about power and control. Hazing is also has some aspects of power and control as well, but it's rooted more in maintaining traditions or hierarchy. So the difference between like a bullying and a victim is that the victim is meant to be continuing to be in that vulnerable state. Hazing is about eventually that power and control shifts as the person moves through the hierarchy of the organization. But this can have lasting effects on someone psychologically or physically, even though they get through it and become, you know, top of the, you know, the hierarchy later on, and then they are able to implement it. It becomes desensitized to what has actually happened to someone who has been hazed. So there are a lot of different types of hazing behaviors. So one that we probably think of initially, and that has more or less times gone in the news first or has brought up the subject of thing, is when someone has had some kind of physical harm, which can range from, you know, beatings to some kind of physical ailment that has happened because of what a person's had to accomplish or was forced to do in a hazing process. Another big one is forcing sleep deprivation, exposure to weather, confinement, so a small space or a specific area or room that new members or whoever's being hazed is not allowed to leave, or extreme strenuous activities. So, you know, going out into the middle of a field where the weather is an ailment and not being able to get back to where you are. The different types of runs that people do to, like, you have to keep up with, or are just, they're not physically able to even accomplish those activities because they are so extreme depending on the circumstances. Any activities involving the coercion or intimidation, so not having someone, so manipulating someone into performing a behavior like consuming alcohol, utilizing drugs or tobacco products, or even any other form of liquid or substance, and feeling like they have to do this to fit in or to move on to the next level or step in the initiation or progression process. Any activity that intimidates or threatens with ostracism, so like if you don't do this, you're not going to be allowed in, or you're going to be singled out amongst your cohort or class. Extreme emotional stress, so one thing could be the priorities of obligations that people have and putting stress on, you need to, you know, choose these things with the organization and let everything else fall. Classes, employment, family, or other responsibilities that someone may have. Embarrassment or shame or humiliation that adversely affects the individual's mental health or dignity. I'm going to go into the difference later of embarrassment, shame, and humiliation, because a lot of the times we interchange those words, but they are very different and they have very different effects on a person. And then any activities that involve violation of state or federal laws or school policy and regulations. These could all be categorized as hazing behaviors. Any other examples? or questions on examples, or we can wait, or if you're still considering, that can also be a question for at the end. We'll give people a moment to type if they have one. And feel free, you can put it to me directly if you don't want your name written out or you don't want everyone to see, or you can share out loud.
Use the right 2 lanes to take exit 17B to merge onto I-49 South toward Alexandria. Take the exit.
Okay. So I can't talk about mental health and I can't talk about hazing without talking about trauma. So when we think about trauma or the definition of trauma, what does trauma mean to you? Or what do you consider trauma? Okay, so it's Anna Alden said that it's an event that has caused stress and also a little change in your brain. Samantha said that an event that has happened that has affected the person's mental health and well-being in a negative way. And Kyla said trauma is similar to tragedy in that it leaves a long-lasting impact, often very emotional. Lindsay shared that something that mentally impacts someone in a negative way. And Savannah shared that damage from an event or a situation that changes you emotionally, mentally, or physically. So I hear a lot of very similar definitions, and trauma is not something that is new or not talked about as much, which is a good thing. And then Anna said something that's mental or physical wrong that you live with. So we define trauma as an event or series that involve fear or a threat. So, or perceived fear or a threat. So something that maybe feels like something that is unknown. If anyone's ever seen the movie Inside Out, there's a portion of the movie where a new experience comes into the little girl's brain and it's automatically categorized as a fear response. Until that person has had multiple events of it, then anything really that is unknown to us, we categorize as a fear response, because we as humans want some experience and some knowledge before we enter any situation. Hence why we don't really like change and we don't really like uncertainty. So given everything that's going on right now, that is just not compatible to how most of us try to live our day-to-day life. Now, if we have something that is usually not a fearful event that is turned into a fearful event, that is when our brain chemistry, which I don't remember who alluded to that, can be changed, and we then can begin fearing things that maybe normally are not a scary response into a scary response, which is a trauma response. So the 3 E's of trauma is an event, a series of events, or circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening or perceived life-threatening, I always like to put, and that has lasting adverse effects. So it's an event that one person has experienced that has lasting effects. Now, this experience can be direct or indirect, which I'll get into a second. but that is the basis of trauma. So a lot of different things can be perceived as trauma or be categorized as trauma, but may or not be a trauma response for one person, but maybe a trauma response to another, or trauma experience for another person. For example, 4 people might be in a car accident. One person might have a very significant fear and never want to be driving again. Another person might go through the same experience and be okay to be in the car the next day. This has to do with a person's resilience, but also history of traumatic events too. So it depends, and why it's important to have good supports, good coping skills, and a way to talk about mental health to be able to address those trauma responses so people can recover more quickly than they would. Not saying that person is ever not going to be able to go in a car again, but it depends on the genetic makeup of a person, nature versus nurture, and what a person has already experienced before the trauma event. Okay, we'll get into some. So what are other examples of trauma events before we get into what things can be classified as trauma? All right, so Alden said emotional, physical, or psychological abuse. That can definitely be trauma. Kyla said something very similar, physical, mental, or emotional abuse. Or things that can be traumatic. All right, I'm gonna get into the list of trauma things. So typical ones that you think of can be natural disasters. So hurricanes, fires, floods, things that are very impactful that can affect a lot of people. Human-caused disasters, so accidents, wars, acts of terrorism, things like that. Community violence, robbery, shootings, group trauma, hate crimes that can affect a particular community. And I'm going from the top down, so we're talking about macro first, so overall group. And then when we think about meso, which is like family or smaller systems, and then individual trauma, so micro, as well as we're kind of going through this. So school violence could be one, historical trauma. So when we think about historical trauma, we think about genetic or lifespan trauma that expands across generations. So we think about mass genocide, we think about the context of slavery in the United States, the Holocaust victims, or anything that's in the context of historical trauma and what that does to generations later on. Specifically racial trauma, so traumatic events experienced or resulting from direct or indirect experiences of racial harassment, systemic racism, violence that was either directly involved that someone witnessed or indirect experiences. So people around them that identify in that same racial group, primarily people of color that have experienced some kind of racism either in their own specific environment or in the context of where they live or the other relationships that are around them. Then we move on to family trauma. So that can look like abuse, neglect, witnessing domestic violence, even incarceration of family members, substance abuse, or sudden grief. Any grief and loss can be a trauma response and experience as well. Refugee and immigrant trauma. So moving moving or having to move from somewhere where you were born to escape some kind of violence or exposure to war, context like that. Medical trauma, so any type of like pain or injury. So we think about sports injuries, accidents that have happened that have caused some major medical concerns, and what that may have been like, if it was a positive or negative outcome from that procedure. And then poverty, so lack of resources, homelessness, financial stressors can also be a type of trauma. Where we get into complex trauma is being exposed to multiple traumatic events. So you obviously can probably see an overlap that some trauma can fall into multiple categories of this. And it's the immediate and long-term effects of these experiences that have developed over time as well. So if we know what trauma is and what trauma looks like, we also need to know what happens when someone experiences trauma. So if you think about trauma responses, if you see someone and they have gone through a traumatic event, what may they act like, show emotionally, or behaviors they might present after a trauma happens? Might be hostile, might act secluded, says Jaden. Might be fearful, absolutely. There's lots of different examples too. So to also be why I'm not sure what happened. So shock and disbelief is a big trauma reaction because our brain has not fully processed it. We also said jumpy. They may act more shy and reserved if they were more extroverted before the trauma, says Savannah and Jaden as well. Speculation about what happened. So when we think about when we've experienced something that is really scary, our brain can go into protective mode. So we think of fight, flight, or freeze. When we are in that freeze mode and wanting to not draw attention to ourselves, we're trying to protect ourselves. Sometimes our brain doesn't fully process what happens. Hence why sometimes after an event, some of the details might not be super salient or super clear about what happened, or some details might be so overly pertinent to us that we really focus on maybe the door handle of the car that we were in, or a very significant sense of smell after an event has happened. So there's some speculations wanting to know more information because our brain didn't process it in the moment to go into our long-term memory. So increasing fear, anger, frustration can also happen when the shock wears off of a trauma. You may experience agitation and anxiety, depression, isolation, withdrawing, or some suicidal ideation. Some big difficulty concentrating or sustaining focus. If we are really affected by trauma, sometimes the memories of what happened or the lack of memories that what happened can affect our way to be present in the moment. Irritability or low tolerance for frustration. Being scared, as in the context of like, I don't want to go anywhere that reminds me of the traumatic event. I might be more vigilant and be more cautious about things depending on where I am. I might be more keen to sit in a certain place so I can see my exits and be aware of my surroundings. There might be some nightmares and sleep disturbance. I talked about the memory issues. You may see some eating habit changes, feelings of guilt, shame, and self-blame, depending on what your role was or was not in the trauma. Headaches, stomach aches, digestion issues. If we're not sleeping, if we're not eating, if we're having all of these emotional responses, sometimes that can affect us physically as well. Again, anger and aggression may come from because we're feeling out of control, wanting to get more control. Anger is one of those emotions that we feel very powerful and have a lot of control when we have an anger response at times. So sometimes, unfortunately, that becomes a piece sometimes from a trauma response. There might be some mistrust in forming and maintaining relationships, depending on if we were in a situation where we were betrayed or let down, or supports that we thought were there were not there. And then memories of previous traumatic events we or others have experienced. So I link that to sometimes vicarious trauma can happen. So if you watch the news and you're constantly seeing some negative news stories, or watching a shooting that happened, or videos of, you know, something that's violent that maybe has happened to people who look like you, or you have experienced yourself, or have just heard a lot of people talking about the things, that can also cause some vicarious trauma too, because you're absorbing what they are saying and feeling and internalizing it in some ways as well. Some of these reactions may be immediate, and some of these reactions might come later on. So when shock wears off, maybe in a few days, in a few weeks, or even months later, when our system has kind of reset itself, sometimes we can have these trauma reactions come back, even though we think we are okay and have bounced back. Sometimes we have a delayed reaction to some of those things. And I know I went through a lot of different pieces of trauma, so I wanted to give a little moment if people needed clarification on any of these things about reactions or responses, or even what a traumatic event is. Okay. And I do want to point out this list is very extensive because, again, like how people perceive trauma or experience trauma, it can look very different to different people. And it depends on the person, it depends on the context, but sometimes how our body reacts is not going to be different to the other person. So a lot of these things could be also not trauma, but a lot of the times if we have an event or a route that we can lead it back to, it likely is a trauma reaction. Okay. So why hazing is linked to trauma? So one, embarrassment, guilt, and humiliation are linked to shame, which if I go back real quick, that's what we're talking about when feelings of guilt, shame, and self-blame is a trauma response. In the second column, embarrassment, the difference between embarrassment, guilt, humiliation, and shame is that embarrassment is something that is fleeting and often can turn into humor later. Doesn't feel good in the moment, but it usually passes later on. Guilt is when someone feels that they did something bad, and it can trigger the will to fix it and make up for what that which has been done. And I should have also put he, she, they did something bad to make up for what has been done. So it can be a way to change behavior. So guilt can be sometimes a good way to change behavior depending on the context. Humiliation is when it's an undeserved feeling from an experience of unjustified shaming. So it can lead to anger and hate. So the amount of humiliation a person feels where it's more than embarrassment and it's meant to be isolating and attention brought on a person in the context to make them feel extremely embarrassed and humiliated, that is something different that people do not bounce back from. What grows into that is shame then can cause a person to feel bad about themselves. So instead of that I did something terrible or they did something terrible, shame then forms into I am a terrible person. Even when things happen to me and it wasn't my fault, that guilt I absorb then and it becomes my own and it makes it about my characteristics then. So the impact of what shame can do is that it can affect a person's self-esteem. It can affect their overall mental health. Like I talked about before, all those trauma responses directly are evident to someone's mental health status and stability. It can cause things like addictions to try to pacify the shame, depression, suicide rates, aggressive behavior, and even eating disorders can come from acts of prolonged shame and feeling those things to be internalized about a person. This all comes from the work of Brené Brown, who is a shame researcher who has a lot of books and research about what shame does to a person, not specifically related to hazing, but hazing can cause shame in the long run, depending on the context. When over time humiliation it becomes normalized, then it becomes shamed. So going back to hazing and trauma, 71% of those who are hazed do suffer from negative consequences. This comes from the Consequence of Hazing Project. Some of these can be sleep problems, difficulty to form relationships, decreased self-esteem, depression, loss of control, poor performance in class, problems in relationships, post-traumatic stress symptoms, so re-experiencing the trauma, flashbacks, things like that, loss of interest in being part of organizations, illness or hospitalization, that could be psychological or physical injury, and then psychological symptoms, like I said before, can happen after the hazing event or symptoms may appear later. If you compare this list from the negative consequences to my list about trauma, they're almost identical in a lot of ways. Which is why it's important to know that the causing of hazing is directly related to causing someone trauma. Okay. So when we think about hazing and trauma, is any of this surprising to anyone? Or did we ever think about that trauma can be a result from hazing? Yeah, so Samantha said it was never something I connected and associated together. Yeah, we don't really think about it because usually hazing is physical activities, and it's not necessarily an experience because you're a group together at times experiencing the hazing. If it affects the group, maybe it won't affect the person individually. Anyone else have thoughts? Right, Lindsay said that her dad. Lindsay said that from her dad that there are multiple negative effects of psychological effects from hazing. And Kyla said it's also not surprising, but it's disheartening that it continues to occur within Greek life. It is sad. And I think where this comes from is, even though it's not surprising, it's connecting the dots, right? Like sometimes we don't realize that something is connected until that information is presented with us. And then once education comes, then we can talk about belief changes. So when we think about trying to make new beliefs and behaviors about hazing and mental health, what kind of new beliefs does a fraternity and sorority system need to be able to make these changes happen? So the beliefs before, if you know about how hazing is okay, is that it's tradition, it's normal, it's a rite of passage, nobody wants to speak up, things like that. So if we want new beliefs, what types of beliefs and behaviors need to happen? Mental health is just as important as physical health. With Savannah. Which makes me think normalizing, talking about your physical health, making it normal to talk about your mental health. When we say how we're doing, maybe sharing actually how we're doing instead of just, I'm good, how are you, I'm good, and moving on. Samantha also said, should be sympathetic enough to be motivated to make a change and stop normalizing the act of hazing. So I'm hearing like some buy-in as well. That's good. So open discussion obviously starts first. So coming in here, I think, is a great representation of everybody sharing what they think and feel about this. And that's a way to destigmatize mental health as well. Building new types of trust, because if trust was broken, the only way to regain trust is to begin at the foundation and begin building that back up. Having some respect. So not only just to change things, but the right to change your mind and the openness to try new things and coming at it from an idea of growth and learning rather than guilt or shame or that we did something wrong and become defensive about it. Transparency. So talking about your hazing policies when it comes from your national organizations, talking about that immediately when it comes to recruitment and what you all do to prevent hazing is really important as well. Communication. So opening that line of when things happen, how you report it. These are a couple of things that I've found of organizations that are about hazing prevention, and student involvement has a great piece about hazing prevention as well. They have a reporting site, and there's also a national hazing hotline too that people can be in contact with as well. But there's lots of stuff specifically for Memphis that is out there as well. Accountability. So just because you're in a position of new member coordinator or chapter president, having everyone have an accountability piece too, to have everyone's safety and well-being be a priority. And then that will begin to change the belief system, because the belief system that was created that has been normalized started somewhere too, right? Like all those things and the level of what hazing has become or has been in the past all began somewhere because nobody wanted to act or say something. It became a groupthink aspect of, no one else is saying anything, this must be okay, I'm just going to go with it. But it only takes one person as a bystander to begin challenging that behavior or that belief, and then being consistent with it too. So not just doing it one time, but continuing to do it. So just because it's one hazing prevention week doesn't mean that hazing prevention shouldn't happen the rest of the academic year either. But it's highlighted to reaffirm, like, okay, this is one of the things that we should and should not be doing, and revisiting that it's an always thing, not just a sometimes thing. So specifically when it comes to after trauma response, these are a few things that can be done, and I'm going to have more resources at the end, but accepting your feelings and thoughts as how they are is a great way to start. That no one can tell you how you feel, or you shouldn't feel that way. Your feelings are inherent and they come from a source, and if people aren't validating your feelings, like, then they're not being there to be supportive and whatnot, because your feelings are your feelings. The things that you can change are your thoughts, which can eventually change your feelings and then your behaviors. But validating what you are feeling is the first step, and having more emotional awareness as well. So talking with others about your experience is very important. Practicing self-care, which looks very different for every different person. So, but self-care should always be something that you enjoy and that is meaningful for you, and it shouldn't feel like a chore or a burden. And engaging in familiar spiritual practices, that can be religious or non-religious, so something that makes sense to you, that is grounding to you, and then resuming your normal routine. And then sometimes after a trauma response, if you don't feel like you're seeing a reverberation back to normalcy, that's when maybe seeking out professional help might help decrease the severity. Okay, but discussion time. So questions about hazing and mental health in general, or where do we go from here? And then I will leave you with our contact information, resources, and a couple other things to engage with her office as you need. Okay, how can we as group members better help to combat hazing? Well, I think thank you, Kyla, for asking. I think asking the question is really important. I think doing things like this is a first start too. So having that conversation and accountability, right? And at times it's asking and seeking support from your executive committees or the Office of Fraternity and Sorority Affairs to help, keep those accountable pieces too. So when you see something, say something. It's just the same thing as any other bystander training. We always talk about when you see something, say something. It may not be a direct response, like you call it out right there, but it's maybe making a report later, asking someone about that later, or if you were in that situation, what would you want someone to do to help advocate or help you? So that's definitely a great start. And what your organizations probably have as hazing prevention from a national standpoint, making that more of a conversation than just a 1 day or 1 module workshop that you do just to get through the requirements of your chapter evaluation is important too. So making it just more common practice that you talk about hazing. And then Savannah asked, how can we help people feel more comfortable talking about their mental health? So I always talk first with modeling. So that's either, bringing those things to your chapter and having room for those discussions. That's, sharing your story if you feel comfortable sharing your story. Asking those questions and being those people can be a definite way to demonstrate that you are a safe space to talk about mental health, but also that, this chapter invites that, and that can just also be just bringing in a speaker to talk about mental health and to normalize it if you feel like you don't have the way to talk about it or the skills to be able to bring it together. But that's a good way to normalize that, and that people aren't alone. I think it's great, one, when we think about people who are super influential. The athletic world right now is really talking a lot about mental health. I know one specifically that came out 2 weeks ago, Dak Prescott from the Dallas Cowboys, talked about his struggles with mental health and even the backlash that he received from one particular person. People reached out and made sure to call out that behavior of re-stigmatizing mental health and how that is. So one, I think having people who are influential begin to talk about that. So when you think about motivating your chapter, if you haven't read Motivating the Middle, I can't remember the author's name, but it's a great book of who you focus on too. So it all starts from your executive committee, but it's also the majority members, right, that have the aim to be able to be more influential in your chapter. So if you can get more buy-in of people talking about this and being willing, that's when you can start seeing change too. We see that in curves of when you're doing studies or evidence or how you change. That's one way to definitely do that. Modeling is the first step for sure, and making it feel okay. Any other questions? And you're welcome. Absolutely. I'll go real quick, and if everyone has any more questions, I'll still answer them, but I want to be mindful of people's time. So we are here at the Counseling Center to be able to support you all. If you are looking, talking that if you are not going to counseling as not necessarily a factor that has to be a thing for people to seek help, but here we are at the Counseling Center to be able to provide that for you. People who want counseling, if you are a currently enrolled student, you're eligible for 6 individual counseling sessions in the fall and in the spring, and our group therapy is unlimited. One of the things that I talked about resiliency before, we have a specific resiliency group of how to strengthen that muscle of being more resilient in the face of adversity. So that's a new group that we're doing that I think is a great aspect that people don't really talk about. All of our services are virtual on a HIPAA compliant platform similar to Zoom, but it's specifically made for therapy. So everything, again, is still confidential in a secure space. It's just virtual for right now. And services are at a free or minimal cost as well. But we also do couples counseling. So that could be partners, roommates, family, friends. We have done things for chapters before, whether it's outreach or consultation. If you have a struggle that happens in your chapter and need assistance or a loss, we're here for that as well. Any medication that is needed, we can help manage that through your insurance or through our own psychiatric resources. And then we also do testing for learning disabilities. So things like having trouble in the classroom, concentration, or just not keeping up with things, it might be worthwhile to look and see if that's something that maybe should be addressed with attention or academic or learning disabilities as well. And then we do outreach presentations like this. So workshops, trainings, things like that. You can keep up with us on our social media to learn more about that. This is just a little bit about, with everything going on with COVID-19, I know that things are not easy for anyone to deal with, but especially trying to navigate college and having to adjust to a different learning environment. Make sure to do some of these things if you haven't. Number one thing is, when we don't have control, learn how to find some control in your life. So that could be your routine, that could be your study space. Get outside when you can. There is just a certain aspect of being out in the natural environment that changes our brain chemistry and mood that no other activity can replicate, according to research. So being outside where you can, or being next to natural light and having your windows open or the shades undrawn is important. Limit your screens and your stressful discussions, whether that's around COVID-19, even things about we're trying to be better allies in response to the racism and traumatic events, current and historical, that have been going on. So limit those discussions, but also keep having those discussions too, because change needs to be made. Acknowledging your feelings, engaging with some creative aspects, connecting with others. These are just a couple of lists of things that you can do as well. And if it's helpful, I can send up this PowerPoint to Rebecca and Kelsey after this to distribute if you want some of this information handy for your chapter members, with our contact information as well. We also have a lot of different resources and self-help guides as well. You can check it out on our websites to learn more about that. But all these different organizations have come together to try and combat what is happening in the world right now with the anxiety and stress that has come from this pandemic. So reach out and look at those if needed. And here's all our contact information. The relaxation zone, Oasis room, are closed for the fall. We hope to reopen in the spring. But these are great stress management resources for all of our students to use. You don't have to be a counseling center client to use these things, but we have lots of different workshops in lieu of that this year to do. And you can find out information about how to access our virtual waiting room on our counseling center website. So you walk in during our walk-in hours. If you want a first-time appointment, you'll meet briefly with one of our admin staff to fill out some paperwork, and then meet with one of our therapists that are on walk-in times that day. And then you'll be assigned an individual or group that best works for your needs and your schedule. But keep up with our website for all current information on counseling, and also for the health center as well. We will be having continued COVID-19 testing, and also flu shots coming sometime in October. So be on the lookout for that. You can also keep up with us on social media to learn more about those things. Your first visit to the counseling center can be done on our website. So like I said, the walk-in hours, you'll come through and do it over, it's like Zoom as well, and that's how you would meet with a first-time appointment. That appointment usually lasts about 20 to an hour, depending on how fast you go through the paperwork, and then how about your first appointment meeting with a therapist, about 15 to 20 minutes. If more therapy is needed, then you'll be scheduled for an intake session, which is about a 45-minute session. A lot of questions, gathering history, work on with your therapist. And here's all of our social media. We're on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. That's the best way to keep up with us besides our website. We have a lot of virtual workshops and presentations on our YouTube as well. So you can kind of go through at your leisure some of our workshops and skills about mindfulness, wellness, stress management, test anxiety. And then we also launched a podcast this summer too. We have different topics that we present on, everything from allyship to mindfulness to healthy relationships and things like that. And I had the contact information twice, I'm sorry. All right, I'm gonna put this in the chat too, but we would love to hear your feedback about how this was for you today. You can use your phone, or I'm gonna put the link in the chat too. It's an anonymous survey just about what you experienced today, just to give us feedback on your experience with our outreach. Any other questions I can answer? I'm gonna stop sharing and put the link in the chat.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Victoria, for coming and talking to everyone today. I think you did such a great job talking about hazing and how it relates to mental health and just the importance of mental health, especially as you touched on with COVID and everything kind of going on. And so I'm so glad to see so many people were able to make it. And in case anyone is wondering, we did record it so that it will be posted on Tiger Zone for anybody who was not able to get in, because I know there were some issues with people being able to join because we ended up maxing out the participants at one point. So that will be posted in Tiger Zone with a quick 2 or 3 question quiz just so that we can confirm people watching it. But people will still be able to get credit for watching it if they watch the recording. But again, thank you for being here. And if you have any other questions, we can hang on for like a couple minutes to see if anybody has anything else that comes up. But
yeah, absolutely. I can stay on if you have an individual question. And if you have something after this you want to reach out, you can always reach out to me via email or call the counseling center and just ask for me, and I'm happy to answer questions or consult after this if needed. And I know everyone's saying thank you, but thank you all for coming today. I know this is a credit thing for some, but I appreciate the dialogue and great modeling for your other members as well. Well, everyone have a good rest of your day, semester. Good luck. I hope things turn out to be better. Don't stress if you need us. We're here, but take care. Go Tigers and be well.